What's up, YouTube? My name is Titus, and I am a gacha streamer turned variety streamer and a Yu-Gi-Oh TCG player. And today, I am here with a Master Duel video, and I'd like to discuss deck building. And not necessarily what engine or archetype I should focus on or play. There are a lot of content creators that are doing wonderful videos on free-to-play and budget decks that you should go check out. But I want to more focus on what staples I should be creating with my crafting materials. And so, the first question is for new players, what are staples? Deck staples are the cards that are used throughout almost every single modern meta Yu-Gi-Oh deck, regardless of what engine or archetype that you are playing. This can range from your powerful hand traps, your monster or spell removal cards, or cards like Old School Pot of Greed that allow you to draw and dig deeper into your deck and maintain your advantage. And this is why they're important. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is now about interaction with your opponent. Most modern meta decks will set up boards with some kind of monster or trap removal, either a monster negate or an omni negate, which means any card you activate, they can usually negate it, and that's once per turn. And they possibly have what's called a hand trap sitting in their hand, or some kind of interaction set on the field. So having these staples and hand traps will help you push through your opponent's board or stop them from making their plays. And another reason why they're important, as I stated just a minute ago, is they're universal through mostly every single deck. A lot of them are going to be playing a lot of the same cards to round out your engine and your archetype. And since this Master Duel is a gacha in a sense and has a lot of resources and a lot of metas to focus on, I think it's a good idea to focus on specific universal cards. So far, really, the Master Duel archetypes to play certain engines and decks are pretty cheap, with the exception of Thunder Dragon. So building these archetypes like Tri-Brigade or Drytron or things like that are a little cheaper. So which leads me to, where should I focus my crafting? And I'm going to take a second, we're going to get off all the copium hype that everyone has been talking about, and I want to focus this on new players and on TCG players who are returning and on a budget or completely free to play. Right now, Master Duel is doing this OCG ban list, which meaning a specific card called Max C is at 3 right now. I would try to avoid the hype as a free-to-play or budget player and ignore crafting this card. We don't know where Master Duel is going to go with a ban list option or a certain play option, whether you could use the TCG ban list or the OCG ban list or a mix of the two. And we don't also know how they're going to handle crafting or disassembling your forbidden cards, if you get the full value back or if you get partial value back. So I want to focus on TCG meta staples for now, since getting all these staples are going to take some time anyway. So with that out of the way, I'd recommend using your crafting materials to craft your deck staples, and the number one card I'd focus on first is Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. And we can take a quick second here to explain what crafting is. You can see in the top left up there is an N, an R, an SR, and a UR, and these are the materials to craft different cards. So you can dismantle extra cards after you've done some of your solo mode and done a couple of your ranked matches after you're starting to build your deck, and you can dismantle extra cards you don't need. And one rarity costs 3 dismantled of the same rarity. Okay, so we go back to Ash Blossom. This card is so universal and used in almost every single deck. It's probably one of the best hand traps out there besides the topic of Max C. It stops your opponent from searching, so like Pot of Greed, or a card that searches a specific card like Reinforcement of the Army. It also stops them from special summoning a card from their deck. And it also stops what we call a Foolish, which is sending a card from the deck to the grave. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh, every single deck is going to do one of these things once, if not several times. But a well-timed Ash Blossom can really hurt a play if the opponent doesn't have any follow-up or if you do it at a very specific time, it can really hurt their board. The hard part is Ash Blossom is a ultra rare, so the top rarity of the game. And there really isn't much of an alternative to this card. Luckily, right now, there is a bonus package for this card. It costs 750 gems. You don't have to buy them. It can be free to play gems. And this gives you 10 Master Duel packs, along with 1 guaranteed Ash Blossom. And not only is it a discount on your 10 packs, but you get the guaranteed copy of the card. So now you only have to craft 2 of these. So you have to come up with 60 of the UR crafting material. I'd recommend doing all of the special packs, the special bonus packs for 750 a piece if you haven't already. There are some very good cards in there. And so after you do all of this and you've started pulling, you've started disassembling cards you don't need, make sure to try and craft 3 of these as soon as possible. Next, another very good universal staple I would focus on is Infinite Impermanence. This is a trap card, but is also a hand trap, I guess, because if you control no cards, you can slap it down from your hand on your opponent's turn and negate a monster effect. This is a very useful card, but it also has this really nice alternative that you can even use it on your turn. So say your opponent sets up 1 negate and you want to bait it out and you want to put up Infinite Impermanence and that monster is negated, or they negate the card and the card still functionally did the same thing. But also going first, you can set the card face down as a trap card, activate it, negates a monster, and it will negate a spell or trap in that column that you or your opponent will play in that same column. So very, very useful. Another just huge meta staple that you'll see in almost every single deck. It is another ultra rare. I know that these are expensive. Luckily, there are some alternatives to this card. Not like Ash Blossom. It's not as good, but it will do the job until you can craft this card. And we will discuss those a little later. I want to talk about these meta staples first and most of the ultra rares. And we'll go about the budget staples a little later. So some other very powerful cards in the meta, but are not in every single deck. I would still highly recommend focusing on them after you got your 3 Ash Blossom, after you got your 3 Imperm. One of those cards is another hand trap called Effect Veiler. This is basically a hand trap Imperm, but you can only use it on your opponent's turn. But you discard it and you negate the monster. And it's also not a once per turn. A lot of these cards are once per turn. Effect Veiler is not a once per turn. And also is used in some Spellcrafter decks for some other combos and stuff. So it has a lot of uses, but it's not as universal. Another very, very powerful meta card that a lot of people will see that is in the same vein as Monster Negates is called Forbidden Droplet. This card lets you discard cards from your hand or send them from your field, which is very important, to negate however many monsters your opponent controls as you sent from your hand or field. But your opponent cannot respond with the same cards as you sent. So say there's 2 monsters on your opponent's side of the field, you decide to send 1 monster and 1 trap card. You negate both of those monsters and have their attack, and they cannot respond with a trap effect or a monster effect. Very, very good card. Probably should be high up on your list after getting your base staples of what should be crafted. And then here we also have some other cards to help get your plays, or make sure your plays go off, or help with extending your plays. And the first one I want to talk about is Called by the Grave. Called by the Grave is very useful for negating opponents' hand traps. Because it's a quick play spell, you get to play it basically whenever on your turn. So say you activate a card, Reinforcement of the Army, and you want to grab a Sky Striker Ray from your deck, and your opponent Ash Blossoms you. Well, you can play Called by the Grave to negate that effect, and the search will go ahead and go off. It also has a lot more uses The reason I'm a little tentative on this card, I wouldn't recommend it as the first in this option of these 3 cards I'm about to talk about. The TCG has this at 1, the OCG has this at 2. I would recommend crafting only 1 and seeing what happens with the meta since then. But the real card I would really like you to focus on would be Talents, Triple Tactical Talents, or TTT, as some people will call it. This basically has 3 forbidden cards into 1 card. Whenever your opponent would activate a monster effect, you can either draw 2, like Pot of Greed, Change of Heart, or take control of it, or the Forceful Sentry, I believe, and you look at a card in their hand and send it back to the deck. So if they hand trap you and you still have plays, you can play Tactics and send a card, and then they're on 3 cards, and of course they'll draw for turn, but then they have a limited selection to play with the rest on their turn. And then the last one is Crossout Designator. This card is good, but has some niche play right now. It's not seen as much. It was seen a lot in the OCG. It's not seen as much in the TCG in the current meta that we're at for Burst of Destiny. It's still a really good card. Basically what happens is if your opponent plays something, so say they Nibiru you or Ash Blossom you, we'll talk about Ash Blossom because it's the most universal, the one you'll see probably the most. If they Ash Blossom you, you can quick play Crossout Designator, call Ash Blossom, banish an Ash Blossom from your deck, and then that card cannot be activated for the rest of the turn. So it helps you push your plays forward. So again, the order I would recommend getting these for a meta staple deck would be Talents first, and then go for 1 Called By, and then go for your Crossout Designator. So just a quick recap, we want to go for Ash Blossom first, number 1, Infinite Impermanence as number 2. Get your Talents or Forbidden Droplet, depending on what you are seeing as you climb up the rank ladder, and then go for a Called By and Crossout Designator after that. So, some very powerful removal spells, similar to like Regeki, which you can get for free if you do the solo mode, is a card called Lightning Storm. Man, YouTubing is not as easy as it looks, guys. This is also in a bundle, the same kind of bundle as Ash Blossom, and basically what this card says is if you control no face-up cards, you can destroy all attack position monsters, so a kind of a small Regeki, or all spell and trap cards, so Harpy's Feather Duster, which are also very good cards. Again, this card, similar to Crossout Designator, is played. It's very good when you see it, but it's not always played because maybe your deck can play through a lot of these things and not necessarily need it, but it's good to have with the bundle if you get 1 and fill out your deck. But there are some alternatives to this. Regeki is free when you play the solo mode. It's at 1. It's a very good card. Harpy's Feather Duster also does this. It's at 1. It's not as good, and there are some alternatives to these that are a little less expensive than this. And then the last expensive hand trap that I like to talk about, there are some other ones in here, but this is more for meta play, is Nibiru, the Primal Being, or the Rock. And this card lets you tribute all the monsters on your opponent's side of the field and on your side of the field if they have summoned 5 times, and then it summons on your field, and then you summon a token with the combined original attack of all the monsters that were tributed. Very good for if your opponent doesn't set up a negate and they summon a bunch of times and they're about to go into another big monster that you probably can't get over or that creates a negate, and you can drop the Rock. Very, very useful card. It's seen in a lot of meta play. It's mostly side decked, but a lot of decks also can main deck this. So that kind of does it for like the must-have cards. There are 2 other hand traps, and Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion, and Ghost Bell and Snow Rabbit. These kind of fall in and out of play. Snow Rabbit really hasn't seen much play recently. Ghost Bell, on the other hand, when we get Destroy Phoenix Enforcer, has seen some good play because it can stop the Destroy Phoenix Enforcer's graveyard effect. So There is an alternative to this card that is cheaper that we will talk about just here in a second, but I want to get to some of these super rare cards along with some of these trap cards and alternatives here. And so the super rare cards I want to talk about are the pots. The pot of greed, pot of desires, pot of extravagance. These are the cards that allow you to dig in your deck and get more of your engine to extend your plays. So because Old School Pot of Greed is banned now, we now have these alternatives, and the number one alternative I would say to craft, and it's just a super rare, and I know I say just a super rare, but really from pulling some packs with some free gems, I've noticed that super rares are actually pretty common. So getting 3 of these is going to be pretty easy. You should craft 3 Pot of Desires. If you already know your deck list, then this is kind of like a little bit of a redundant video and you're kind of here for the hand traps. You could also craft 3 Pot of Prosperity. These 2 cards are used in most all meta decks, whether it be Desires or Prosperity. Desires is banish 10 cards from the top of your deck, and then you draw 2 cards. Pot of Prosperity is more of a different type of card where you banish 3 or 6 of your extra deck of your choice, not random, of your choice, and then reveal 3 or 6 cards and pick one of them and the rest of them go. So it allows you to necessarily dig deeper, but not necessarily get more advantage. So if you need only 1 engine piece to really start your plays, this card is really good. If you're looking for getting more advantage, more cards in your hand to have hand traps or interruptions, Pot of Desires is probably the better way to go. But they're both very useful. I recommend crafting them pretty much as soon as possible. These other ones, these other pot cards are a little bit more nuanced. For instance, this Pot of Extravagance, it says we banish 3 or 6 cards from the extra deck, now completely at random and face down, and then you get to draw 1 or 2 cards. So this is useful for cards that don't necessarily need the extra deck and want to just draw advantage, usually like trap decks or things of that sort. There's also Pot of Duality. It is similar to Prosperity where it will only reveal 3 cards. You get to choose one of them, but then you can't special summon for the rest of the turn. So not very good for like these link climbing decks or these mass special summon decks that want to get a bunch of monsters on the field. This is more for your slow play control type of decks, but a still very good card. And then the last one here is Avarice. This targets 5 monsters in your graveyard, shuffles them back, and draws 2. So it's really good for like Zodiac, where your cards want to get back into an extra deck or back into your main deck. You shuffle them up and you draw 2. But it's not useful for every deck because some decks like to have their resources in the graveyard, since the graveyard is a very good resource for modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And then let's talk about some of these super rare hand traps that are useful. I think one of the best ones is Didi Crow or a card called Skullmeister. And I mentioned earlier that there's an alternative to Ghost Bell. Skullmeister is kind of that alternative where if a card is activated in the graveyard, you can quick effect discard the card. It's actually not discard, it's send, which actually matters, and negate that effect. And then Didi Crow is discard the card, not send, and target a card, any card, in your opponent's graveyard and banish it. And because, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the graveyard is a big resource for a lot of decks, banishing a card that is like a target for a monster reborn or is activating an effect to special summon itself like a zombie monster, it can be used to banish it and get it out of there and kind of stop plays. Another great super rare hand trap is Droll and Lockbird. Basically what this card says is if your opponent adds a card from the main deck to their hand, except when they draw, you can drop this card down and no player can add cards from the main deck to their hand for the rest of the turn. Now, if you were lucky enough to get a Max C, or you went ahead and crafted Max C and you're waiting to see which hand traps to get, make sure you know that Droll and Lockbird affects both players, which means if you drop Droll and Lockbird and then you max, or if you Max C first and then drop Droll and Lockbird, you will not be able to draw. You basically wasted a card. So make sure you know it affects both players. Another great alternative hand trap that is another good negate and it can follow up with some certain plays is a card called Cyframe Gear Gamma. I'm a little hesitant to recommend this card because in the OCG it's limited to 2. In the TCG it is unlimited. You can play it at 3. And so it's still good at 2, but you just don't see it as often. the great thing about this card is when your opponent activates a monster effect, reveal it from your hand, special summon it, and special summon a card called Psyframe Driver. Good thing, if it's on your turn, you can do a bunch of plays. If it's not on your turn and Driver is in your hand, or if it is your turn and you draw Driver for a turn, Driver is just what we call a brick. It's kind of just a dead card. But I think it outweighs the cons of how good Gamma can actually be because it destroys a card. So let's say your opponent summons a monster, activates its effect, you Gamma them, destroy their monster, they no longer have any more plays because it negated the effect and destroyed their monster. Very, very useful card. And then another final little guy that I like to talk about is Artifact Lancia. Basically what this card does is on your opponent's turn, you can discard this card, and then you can make sure that they can't banish. You also can't banish, but really you're trying to stop your opponent from banishing cards. So this is really effective against the Tri-Brigade, which is pretty easy to get now. You'll probably see that in the ranked ladder, or very good against Phantom Knights, which is a top meta deck, or against Orcust, which you can probably see because the OCG ban list has Harp Horror at 1, which makes it pretty decent. An honorable mention hand trap I want to talk about is Evenly Matched. Because we don't have side decks, I wouldn't really recommend this card, but have it in the back of your mind as a card when we get to best of 3 that could probably be picked up, but really this could be the last thing on your list to pick up. It's useful, but isn't always played in certain metas, and if there's no side deck, we're only best of 1, it's really not worth it to focus on. So let's get into some spell and trap removal. We have cards like Cosmic Cyclone and Twin Twisters. These are the two probably most seen meta cards even now, besides Master Duel, that are played for spell and trap removal. One, Cosmic Cyclone, you pay 1,000 life points, you banish a spell and trap card. Really good for using your life points as a resource rather than your own cards, and to banish cards. So if you see like Eldritch cards that activate Engrave, it's good for banishing those out of the spell and trap zone and removing them. Twin Twisters is also good for more of a mass removal. You discard one card when you play this card, and you spell up to 2 spell or trap cards on the field. So very good if your deck doesn't need as many cards to play, and you can afford to discard the card and pop multiple cards at once. Luckily, there are some alternatives to this card. Mystical Space Typhoon, while not a great card, is a very useful budget card. And you get 3 of these if you went ahead and picked the Synchro structure deck in the beginning of the game. If not, it's just a rare, very easy to craft, very useful for spell and trap removal. And a last bit of removal I want to talk to you about, as you've probably seen from, Playground Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're a returning player, is Dark Hole. This card is just a super rare, has some removal, but has a little bit of a downside to it. It destroys all monsters on the field. But the thing is, it is a non-targeting removal, which can be very, very helpful. So this can be some very useful card if you pull one, luckily, or if you're having trouble up in the higher ranked ladders of having targeted removal and you haven't had a way to craft like a Forbidden Droplet or something like that. So very useful card. Another useful card to do some single target removal that is non-targeting are Kaijus. These cards are really, really good, and while the best one, Gamma Seal, is a super rare, there are some really good alternatives in Godarla. It's a wind Kaiju, which if you get barrier locked, which you might see higher in play because it's one of the best decks in Tri-Brigade or Bird Up, it can tribute a monster on your opponent's side of the field to special summon it, and then it gets rid of that monster. Of course, you gave them a 2700 attack monster, but a lot of meta decks have removal anyway, and it gets rid of the problem card. So Kaijus are pretty good. An issue is Kaijus are usually side decked in the meta. So these, while are great, maybe hold off on them for a little bit until we might get a best of 3 type of event rather than a best of 1 meta. Whew. I know that's a lot of information, and this is a very difficult game to get into, but I'm trying to do my best here. And we're going to go over a couple budget options and alternatives. And one of the ones that I really want to cover is Forbidden Chalice. This card is really, really good. It's a really good alternative to like Droplet or Impermanence or Effect Veiler. The downside is it's only playable on your turn unless you went first and you set the card. So it can't be like your opponent went first and they activate a monster card. Like Impermanence can come down whenever it wants to. Chalice cannot do that. So if you go first and you set it, it's really good for that. More so, this is really good for playing into your opponent's negates. Say if they set up a monster that has a negate and you want to either bait that out or negate it somehow, and so you can play this card when you start your turn up, and you can play it anytime. You don't necessarily have to not control any cards like Imperm. It can be played because it's a quick play spell. It's a really good alternative that is only a rare. I would recommend crafting this for most budget players. The next card would be Book of Moon. This actually sees a lot of meta play, especially in the upcoming set with the Floowandereeze archetype. Book of Moon just flips a card face down. And not only is this useful for going second, it's also useful for going first. You can set this card, and when your opponent summons a monster that they need to link off or use for some kind of material, you can Book of Moon it, and they can't do it anymore. They can only use it for a fusion summon or a tribute summon. So very useful piece of removal without actually removing the card. And then there are some other great cards, and these are mostly trap cards. They're a little slower to play because you kind of have to go first or be in a more simplified state and maintain advantage. But Torrential Tribute is really good for doing a non-target removal. When a monster is summoned, all monsters are destroyed. Very, very good if your opponent sets up a board and then say you don't have much to do and you set a card and then they summon a monster immediately trying to go for game because they get a little eager, and then you flip Torrential Tribute and you destroy their whole board. That's just a very simplified aspect. That won't happen a lot, but it is useful for those little bit simplified states. Or if you can do a thing where you have it set and you're about to do some follow-up plays because you went first, they went second, they kind of broke your monsters, but they didn't break your back row, and then you can summon a monster, flip this card, and destroy their monsters, and maybe have some generation of advantage on your field. Another good thing that is a non-destructive removal is a compulsory evacuation device. We call it Compulse. Flip it, return a monster to the hand. Very good for interruption. When you're going first, they want to play a card and they need it to link climb or exceed or something, or they summon a really big guy and you are kind of scared of it. You flip it and bounce it back. In a similar vein, Phoenix Wing Blast, same kind of thing. You discard one card, you target a card on the field, on your opponent's field, and then you send it to the top of the deck. Very useful for kind of setting your opponent back because now they know what card they're going to draw if they don't have a way to shuffle the deck. And it is good for non-destructive removal because some cards protect against destruction. Another great card is Paleozoic Dynamiscus, and this card basically says target one face-up card in the field, discard one card, and then banish that target. But it has a little bit of a secondary effect where if you activate a trap card in a chain, which if you've played a couple of the duels already, you'll see a 1, a 2, or a 3 and the little chain symbol around it, you can summon this card from the graveyard if a trap card was activated in that chain, but then it's banished. So really useful if your opponent is about to maybe attack you for a lot of damage and they activate a trap card to kind of do some plays. You can go ahead and activate this to stop one of their attacks. There is a whole archetype based around this card, and there's some other Paleozoic cards that are really, really good, and also just the neutral rarity that you can probably start as a budget player and play. Very, very good card. Another one, and last of the rare budget slots, is a card called Lost Wind. It's kind of like an infinite impermanence where you can target a face-up special summon monster, and only special summon monster, and negate its effects and then have their attack, similar to what Forbidden Droplets does. And then if your opponent special summons a card from the extra deck, anytime when this card is in the graveyard, it could be any time when this card is in the graveyard, except during the damage step, which is when an attack happens, you can set it back to your field, and then you get to activate it again. So you can do this at 2 or 3, and then it'll be banished once it sets that way, but it's really good for some recursion. Some honorable mention trap cards that are in the higher rarity that are really good staples to have, but maybe should be focused on a little later, are the Solemn cards. There is a bonus pack for this one at 750, just like Lightning Storm and just like Ash Blossom, so very good to get, but not necessarily I need this now. it really kind of depends on what you're playing. If you're playing a trap-based deck, yes, you should probably get these along with Solemn Strike, another really, really good card. But have these in your mind for, okay, I have a lot of my staples. We're a month or two into the game, 3 months into the game. What else should I be getting? I've got a lot of these other things. Oh, okay, let's get the Solemn cards because these cards are very, very good. Whew, okay. I know that's a lot of information. I know that's a lot for, I know it's probably a little bit longer video, but I want to try and help other players who are new to the game or returning to the game or trying to find competitive ways to climb the ranked ladder. Now, I will go over the extra deck staples in another video because this is probably running a little long, but I really appreciate you guys watching it. Make sure you, smash the like button, like the smash button, subscribe to the channel for more Master Duel videos because I will be doing the extra deck staples as I mentioned, and I'm going to be doing some commentary on some meta decks and higher ranked play, and you know, kind of going over some deck building if people want to talk about it when I go over those match commentaries. So do all these things, comment down below what deck you're playing or what staples you're wanting to get or how lucky you are in your packs. And if you like what you see, also feel free to check me out over on Twitch at twitch.tv/Titus2172. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. Have a great day. Happy dueling.